For those who saw it, it came to the internet now. Now we have a Professor Michael Arbib from University of South California. He's going to talk about monkeys, apes, and humans evolving the language-ready brain. Okay, Michael, please us.
Thank you, Albert. So, actually, it's interesting to compare my worldview with Paul's, because we actually have published models of many of the same systems. But he believes his models are examples of the DAC architecture, and I believe my models have nothing to do with the DAC architecture. He believes it's essential to test his models on robots. I believe I have good tests of my models that do not use robots, even though I have had some robotics. And yet, the models are amazingly part of the same space of trying to understand the brain. So this is just an interesting bit of domain setting. Now, like Paul, I'm concerned about general brain operating principles, but my focus today is rather to say not what is just in common between the macaque monkey, the chimpanzee, and the human, but also what is different, because the human has language and the other creatures do not. So what is the difference, building on those basic operating principles that they share, that distinguishes them? Now, the other point I have to make, of course, is that these are modern creatures, and what I'm interested in when I talk about evolution is what might our last common ancestor with the monkey 25 million years ago have been? What might our last common ancestor with the chimpanzee 5 to 7 million years ago have been, so that we can then suggest what might have been the key changes in brain and behavior and social structure that led us along this path to the modern human. And so at the moment, the discussion is somewhat limited in that we will be tending to conflate, put together the macaque and our last common ancestor, the chimpanzee and our last common ancestor, even though we know there are key differences. But I don't think those key differences matter for today's discussion. For future work, they will. So the general methodology can be shown by this slide. It's what I call comparative computational neuroprimatology, and the figure really does the job. So the notion is that we understand the monkey brain as our representative of the last common ancestor with the monkey. We want to understand the human brain, and the suggestion is there are many functions of the human brain that we believe are controlled homologously. So monkeys have dexterity, we have dexterity, monkeys have eye movements, we have eye movements. And so we think there we can take a good model of the monkey brain where we have the advantage of all the detail of the circuitry from the anatomy and physiology and morph it into a model of certain systems in the human brain. And so this provides the grounding for our work. And then we have to make an evolutionary hypothesis to say what extra circuits had to evolve to have a brain that not only has these shared abilities, like eye movements, hand movements, and so on, and their visual control, but also language. And then, of course, we interpose the ape. So with humans, we have almost no data about the functioning of circuits at the single cell level. Our data is more brain imaging, electroencephalography. So we have large-scale constraints on models. With the monkey, we do have some imaging, but our emphasis there is really getting into the neurophysiology of the circuits. With apes, we have had some fMRI, but it looks like, well, actually it hasn't been fMRI, it's been MRI. You don't try to put an awake chimpanzee in the MRI machine. But even now, it looks like the new guidelines in the United States will forbid even the imaging of the brains of anesthetized chimpanzees. So there we're going to be looking more at the behavior, and in particular the communicative behavior, for challenges to say how does that differ from the behavior and communication of the monkey, to suggest that what the way station might be in the building of new structures on top of the old. So as I say, if that central arrow labeled homology is where you might say we have brain operating principles, that some of which are special even for the higher primates, others are shared by the rat, others are shared by even other creatures. And then we have this evolutionary overlay. Now, I have to apologize now to Donatus, because we are in Nix. And that means that sound is crucial. And so you might think that speech is the primary form of language. I'm going to work towards suggesting that gesture was how language got started, not speech. So my apologies in advance.
You also think about gestures as the base of music.
Oh, of course. Yeah. All right. So first I have to talk about this concept of language readiness. As some of you know, linguistics has been dominated for many years, but fortunately less and less, by the work of Noam Chomsky, who believes that the brain comes equipped with a universal grammar, that somehow the general rules of language are there, and all experience has to do is tune those for a particular language. Whereas I think most of us today believe that the child starts with some basic forms of non-verbal, non-gestural communication, but then language is learned as part of the culture. As I mentioned yesterday, we all understand that almost every human today becomes literate, learns how to read and write, but we are very clear that the brain did not evolve with mechanisms for reading and writing, that this is a construct overlaid by a certain social structure that exploits the brain to rewire it for this new behavior. So when I say a language-ready brain, I'm making the point that, contra Chomsky, this doesn't necessarily mean that our distant ancestors evolved for language in the full sense, but they evolved to have certain abilities for communication that could then, perhaps more through social construction than through brain evolution, yield a society in which language was used. So that's why I say being language ready does not imply having language, but it means that you could take a child from any time, perhaps if you had not mental time travel, but physical time travel, to carry this child from perhaps 200,000 years ago, maybe from a tribe in which there was no real language, to a modern tribe where the child would acquire language. So what is the touchstone of language? I will distinguish, monkeys have some vocal calls, but these are innate, so alarm calls and so on. These are just built in. Apes have vocalization, but they also have gestures, and I will argue, it's still a little controversial, but I will argue that some of these gestures are created by a group rather than having to be innately wired in. And then I will suggest that what comes is proto-language, where proto-language, somehow you have an ability to create, as a group, new communicative acts. But they are sort of units that sit by themselves. And so the breakthrough to language is when you suddenly have a grammar that allows you to put these proto-words together in constructions that actually allow you to say new things, because you take the words or proto-words people already know and you put language on top of them. And because now I can say, hopefully, I am saying something you don't know, and yet you are beginning to know it. through what I say. So that's the sort of stage. So as I said, I think I made it clear why I'm claiming biological evolution gives us a language-ready brain, cultural evolution then exploits that brain as society makes discoveries of how to communicate in new ways. And then, okay, just the point you already mentioned of the reading-ready brain. Our brains were ready to learn to read, but there was no biological evolution adapting to a need to read. But as I say, the Nick's apology is to emphasize that language is multimodal. So it's not just speech, it's not just auditory in, vocal out. As I talk, I'm using co-speech gestures. There's already a coupling between voice and hand. And if you are deaf, you can acquire a sign language as readily as we have acquired a spoken language. And interestingly, if you look at a blind person, when they speak, they will make gestures even though they cannot see them. So there's somehow that basic coupling of voice and hand that works. So I suppose you might say that the people who work on evolution of language can be roughly divided into two camps. Those who said language got started in the hands, but the coupling of voice and hand then eventually led to the evolution of vocal control and speech. And those who think that we developed, like bird song or whale song, an ability to make relatively meaningless sound patterns, and then only later did we come to divide those sound patterns to convey meaning, and only then did the coupling allow us, if we were deaf, to acquire a sign language rather than a spoken language. So these are some of the issues, but let me just give you one example for those of you who have not looked in detail at sign language, to look at the idea that a sign language is not a translation of a spoken language. It is a unique structure that has evolved to exploit the medium of the hand. So I make the obvious joke that it's hard to get a subject with so many hands for this demonstration, but I think you can understand what is happening. So American Sign Language is nothing to do with the American language. It is just the sign language that has developed in America. And so she wants to express what in English we would use the words "the bike is near the house" for. So she signs the house, and then she uses her hand to sort of gesture, think of a house here. And then she goes, think of a bike here. And now this gets you, through the use of the space around the person, to get the idea that the bike is near the house, even though there is no word for near in her signing vocabulary used here. Okay? So this is just to give you the idea of the richness of sign language using what we call the signing space, and the notion then that for most of us, we sort of think of speech as primary, and then, having a sign language is secondary to that. But this example, I think, makes clear that in some sense, you are naturally exploiting the properties of the body interacting with the world. And so in some sense, a sign language is more basic rather than secondary, as we might have thought. So that's just to frame it. Now, the story that I'm telling you today started actually with a paper with Giacomo Rizzolatti back in 1998. His group discovered mirror neurons in the monkey, and we wrote a paper called Language Within Our Grasp. And so about 14 years later, I published this book, How the Brain Got Language, and I advertised a review article that just came out a few months ago called I think you recognize the title, Towards a Computational Comparative Neuroprimatology. Framing the Language-Ready Brain. So if you would like a PDF of that paper, please just send me an email.
Yeah, I probably.
I can remember your name and get an email, so I said. Okay, and so the starting point for relating this discussion to the brain is a lesion study of humans. And we start at the bottom left with the key anatomy that the visual cortex communicates forward into the brain through two pathways. Through the parietal lobe, we call this the dorsal pathway, and through the inferotemporal lobe, we call this the ventral pathway. And the familiar idea is that the neurophysiology says actually if you just study the monkey, then you can record neurons in the parietal lobe that seem to be related to motor activity. What is it about an object when you look at it that says grasp it this way or grasp it that way? Whereas if you look at the inferotemporal path, you begin to see neurons that may be coding what the object is. So the human finding was this, that there was one person who had a lesion in this pathway, and if, for example, you showed this person several cylinders, a big cylinder, a medium cylinder, a small cylinder, and said, tell me how big the cylinder is, they couldn't use the visual input to judge the size of the cylinder. They couldn't tell you how big it was. Even more surprisingly, they couldn't pantomime. You said, well, just show me how big it is. There was no correlation between the size they pantomimed and the actual size. But if you said to them, pick up the cylinder, then the shape of the hand correlated perfectly with the width. So the idea was that this pathway, which we now call the how pathway, was extracting that information about the motor control appropriate to this affordance, this diameter of the cylinder, but this what pathway that allowed one to declare the property, to bring it into the realm of communication. So my current thinking is that more generally this is the pathway for planning. So you do need some spatial layout information to make a plan, but you don't need the fine details. I'm going to reach for the one on the left because it's bigger. That requires some spatial information, but it's not the same as the precise motor control, which says, I must control my arm muscles to get my hand here, I must control my finger muscles to grasp it. Well, I must control my fingers to grasp it properly. So the idea is that this pathway is available in the monkey for planning, but also can become available in the human for communication about plans. And this pathway is the one that takes control of converting the visual experience into the details required for muscle control. And we developed a computational model, and again I apologize to Paul because we didn't test this on a robot. I know it's awful, but we liked it anyway. So here is the idea that what the model does is if you come this way on the dorsal stream, it extracts various affordances. You don't have to know what this is to see that these are possible shapes that you know how to grasp. And then you can choose by some mechanism which to prepare the premotor plan for send to motor cortex and grasp. So this is the sort of thing you will do if you're just faced with a nonsense object or an object that you don't want to use, you just want to move it to a different place. You don't have to know what it is. But in this case, the other stream, the ventral stream, can allow you to recognize that it's a mug, and then the prefrontal cortex can bring working memory into play, motivation into play. I remember there is still coffee in the mug. I'm motivated to take a little break to drink some coffee. So in that case, part of my coding is going to be that then, okay, this is the correct affordance to use. So this plan is then played out by using the dorsal path to extract the appropriate motor parameters for that action. So that's the general scheme here of exploiting the how and the what streams. Now, what I want to do to use that example is, I said this is an example, well, I have implied, I will now say explicitly, this is a case of a model where the model is basically a model of the monkey brain and the human brain simultaneously. In other words, we may change the names of the brain areas as we go from a monkey brain area to a human brain area, but we're nonetheless saying the essential logic of the circuitry is the same, even though it's distorted as you map it onto the two different brains. But now I want to think about this in terms of scene analysis, working memory motivation, to bring in the idea of communication, to sort of think of what we might want to do, and therefore what might be advantageous in the long run of evolution. So the two scenarios, okay, the mug is just sitting on some papers I want to look at, so I just want to pick up the mug and move it, and the mug still has coffee in it that I now wish to drink. But let's consider the case where instead of my wanting to having the mug within reach, instead I want to pantomime this to someone who is nearer the mug than I am. So this is part of, perhaps, of what shared consciousness is about, but I'm not going to talk about that today. They must perceive the visual scene around the mug and separately recognize my communicative behavior. So another vital point about the brain, we've already talked about two visual streams. And in general, there are many different visual streams, because at the same time I might be looking at you in terms of recognizing who you are, looking at your facial expression, following your gestures, and so the same visual information, the same when it leaves the retina, becomes divided in many different ways, specialized for a range of tasks. But anyway, so this person, we assume, at the same time can see there is a mug over there on the papers or sitting with coffee, but at the same time they can build in their visual scene my communicative behavior. And so they are going to have to look at, so what might I do? I might gesture towards the mug and then sort of do something like this, which tells them, I want you to lift the mug and pass me the papers. Or I might go like this, and they say, oh, you want to drink from the mug, and pass the mug. Maybe they will kindly turn it so the handle is facing me when it gets there. So this is just to think about the way in which we can look at an existing model of the monkey and fantasize for a little bit about what we might add to build a communicative model that exploits that circuitry by using it. And again, in some of the terms that Paul talked about, you've got an interesting first-person, third-person interaction there. You as a first person are expressing through your gestures your needs to a third person who becomes the first person who fulfills that need. Okay. So I think these gestures are fairly helpful. Anyway, I mentioned that the starting point for this particular adventure was the work with Giacomo Rizzolatti in the 1998 paper, Language Within Our Grasp. The background for that was a series of papers starting in 92, but the best known one is from 95 by these gentlemen, Rizzolatti, Fadiga, Gallesi, and Fugazi. And the idea was this: they had been recording from this area F5 in the front. F5 just means it's a frontal area of the brain in the monkey, and they called it Area 5. And what they had been doing was they had been placing electrodes in that area and finding that cells there were involved in hand movements. And you could correlate a particular movement, a particular cell with a particular type of movement. So one cell might be best for precision grasp, but another cell might be more active for a power grasp, and so on. So here is a cell, the recording from a cell that is specialized for the precision pinch. And this just shows the firing of the cell on 10 different occasions. And the histogram says this is something the cell is really concerned about, the execution of the precision pinch. And what you see, what you don't see is we could have another picture showing for the same cell when the monkey does this, and then we would see very little or no firing. But the amazing thing was when the experimenter was placing a piece of food on the tray, before he passed the tray to the monkey, the cell started firing. Not quite as vigorously, but it started firing. So in other words, it was firing not only for executing actions, but for observing similar actions. So this is a subset of the cells in F5, and cells in that subset were called mirror neurons. Now, this is where we have to be a little careful. Some people have got so excited about mirror neurons, and in humans, I said we don't have much data on single neurons. We have what they call mirror systems. You might say, we're interested in grasping. In the human, I can't say, here are the neurons that fire for this grasp, but not that grasp. What I can say is there a place in the brain that lights up when I image the brain for when the monkey grasps an object, sees someone else grasp the object, but not for just looking at the object. And that will light up, and it's in a homologous area to the monkey F5, and so that's called a mirror system for grasping, as distinct from a mirror neuron. But many people get so excited about this, they talk as if the mirror system does all the work by itself. So you see many papers where the magical mirror system. So I just remind you immediately of this. This is where we started with our anatomy, that we have a path up here that knows about motor details, but there's a lot more information that comes into planning a behavior that involves this ventral path. And so I just caricature this here by saying that if I just see you make a movement and I immediately make the same movement, then perhaps this is a matter of I observe the action, my mirror neurons code motor details of the action, I play those out over my command neurons, and I immediately imitate. But in general, of course, if I see an action, I have to interpret it, I have to understand it, and plan an appropriate response, and then back to F5 to do what I'm doing. So, for example, I see my friend kindly lifting up the coffee cup. I don't see that in terms of, okay, I will repeat the action of lifting up. I recognize that he has met my request, and I now reach out my hand in this way, ready to grasp the handle. So this part down here is absolutely crucial to using mirror neurons. It's not the mirror neurons by themselves figure all those things out. So the slogan I use is the phrase beyond the mirror. We have to think about mirror neurons in the context of systems beyond the mirror to understand what they do. And then it's not so much when we look at evolution that magically mirror neurons become language mirror neurons. The important point is, how does the brain as a whole change to support the new types of actions to do with gesture or articulation and their recognition. I have half an hour, is that correct? So let me skip this. So just to continue setting the stage, why do we emphasize gesture? we say that monkeys, apes, and humans have great manual dexterity, but this is actually, it should be monkeys and apes share with humans great manual dexterity, but monkeys and apes have limited vocal control, so they can come up with their sort of innate vocalizations, but they can't learn new vocal patterns. The people who tried to teach apes language gave up trying to get them to imitate human speech. In the end, they got them to imitate some gestures of American Sign Language, but the apes could never go beyond individual signs to get the idea of syntax, to get the grammar of putting signs together to make new meaning. So one transition is that the macaque mirror neurons for the hand seem to require looking at how the hand moves relative to an object. So these are transitive actions. These are actions with an object as the goal. But of course, when I do that, lifting of the coffee cup to gesture, it's an intransitive action. I'm not acting on an actual cup. So it seems to be an important transition from the intransitive system to one that can recognize actions, not in terms of their relation to a visible goal, but in terms of their relation to an imagined goal. The other thing is that monkeys cannot imitate. Apes have a limited form of imitation. Humans have much more imitation. And so the evolution of a system for complex imitation is going to be an important part of our story. And then, as we've already indicated, monkeys and apes have genetically constrained call systems. Apes and humans can communicate using some novel manual gestures, and humans alone have language. So this hand-centered argument is the way I will approach it. And I should just confess that I think if you took a poll of people who study the evolution of language, the majority would disagree with it. But they don't come up with a good argument for why I'm wrong. But it is important to understand that we are in a territory in which parts of what I say I think are very well grounded in the data, and other parts are bold hypotheses. Okay, so this is really what we said. Monkeys, and presumably our last common ancestor with the monkeys, little capacity for imitation. Apes, capacity for simple imitation based more on attention to sub-goals than how movements are shaped to achieve them. You have IKEA here in Brazil? IKEA? IKEA?
Loja, store.
Yeah, the store. For what is the equivalent here?
Like dog store.
Where you buy kits and you assemble the furniture yourself. So, okay, so I call it the IKEA effect, IKEA effect, but you can relabel it in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese. So this is the idea. You look at these pictures and you say, oh, I know how to do this, and you throw this in here and you fold that on there, and suddenly you have this horrible mess. And then you realize you have to go back and pay attention to the details. And then when you see not just, how do I get from here to here, I think I know how to get to the goal, and replace that by what are the details of the action to get from here to here. So the claim is that for apes, they can pay attention more to a sub-goal without being able very well to pay imitation to the details of the motion that gets you from one sub-goal to the next. And what I have to then characterize this notion of complex imitation is to say that complex imitation has a separate component which is complex action recognition. I have to look at a behavior and recognize that it falls into various components. And then if I understand that, then I have some possibility of imitating it by repeating that combination. Of course, the story gets complicated because in general, to achieve a goal, you may have to repeat actions a different number of times and so on. But the other important thing is that, of course, when you observe a behavior, in terms of the actions you already know, you may not be correct. There may be details of the action that are not already in your repertoire or that you don't recognize. So it may still require some trial and error to tune an action to get from the familiar action it resembles to one that is best for that particular skill. So we have this overlay, which is, if you like, I don't know if this is correct, but if you like, I think it's more ventral in terms of what planning the overall structure, and you have this more dorsal tuning of the motoric pattern within pieces of the overall behavior. And the claim is this, that this evolved not for communication, it evolved to transmit skills like the use of tools or ways of finding food or ways of hunting or coordinating behavior. And so the claim is that complex imitation did evolve to support practical behaviors, but it provided a substrate which could then be exploited by further evolution to yield new forms of communication. So very roughly, here's the story, that once we get to complex imitation, then we have that ability to recognize the pieces within a behavior. And now the other piece that we'll talk about a little more later is, I suggested that another important transition was from needing a movement to be transitive, to be recognized, to being able to recognize the transitive behavior from an intransitive performance. Okay, we said that this you can recognize as lifting a cup to my lips, even though you can't see the cup. So it's that ability to recognize the action, the underlying action of lifting the cup to the lips from this pantomime. So that idea of pantomime, and why do I say naive pantomime? Because perhaps you know the work of Marcel Marceau, which is already very ritualized. Or perhaps you play the game of charades, where you've already got a language, as it were, of communication in place. And the idea here is that I can perform an action in a way that you can recognize what the action is. It's not the, but that leads to the next side. If I pantomime a behavior, maybe you get it, maybe you don't. And I might have to do lots of other little pantomimes because you're getting the wrong idea and behaving the wrong way. So it can be very costly to perform a pantomime, and there could be a lot of ambiguity. So the idea is that the transition to proto-sign is a community conventionalizes a performance. And so I'm going to use you an example, give you an example that is not historical, but is an actual example in American Sign Language. So I just have to make the little caveat, American Sign Language is a full human language. It's not a relic of what happened 100,000 or 500,000 years ago. But I think this example gives you an understanding of what I mean by the difference between a pantomime and a proto-sign. So let's consider, I want to give you a sense of a plane flying. So I might start with this. And the problem with that, of course, is it's very energetically expensive.
You the bird. You dance the bird.
Well, fortunately, at the time we had proto-sign, there were no planes, so actually it was a bird flying there. All right, but then, so more economically, yeah, so maybe I do this for a bird flying. So yeah, so this was my example. If I do this, what does it mean? So, Gianna, what does this mean? No, it means I'm losing it. That's what my sister said last time she came to one of my lectures. Actually, it means turn up the air conditioning. But this just makes the point. So here's an example from ASL where the pantomime for the plane is just to make a handshake that sort of represents the body and wings of the plane. And if you make the handshake wiggle in place, it means the plane. And if you extend it that way, it means the flying.
We need to have a
So-
farming the group.
So the idea is that this is, well, actually, performances of ASL poetry are very interesting. But the idea is that this is a purely conventional distinction. This is no longer a pantomime. The community has agreed that they will adapt a sign, a pantomime, in different ways to be unambiguous and convey different aspects of what was a big meaning. So the term I talk about is fractionation is an important step towards grammar. Maybe we'll have time to get to that. Okay, so since I'm meant to stop in 7 minutes, what I'm going to do is just to tell you all the things I will not tell you. And then you can ask Donatus for the paper that will give you the details that I don't have time for. So let me...
It's a little bit more than 7 minutes. It's 10 minutes.
I thought you wanted discussion as well.
Okay, including discussion.
Yeah.
That's your talk, enough of discussion.
So the first step is to continue this issue of modeling the monkey brain to get the basis for our evolutionary story. So we've already talked about the FARS model, the Fairgardner-Rizzolatti-Sakata model. Then we go on to a model of the mirror system, where the issue is how does a brain learn to associate the firing of some neurons with the visual observation of an action. And the idea basically is that if the system is learning to recognize its own movements, so it has an internal, a hidden state, which encodes the motor plan for a particular action, then it can observe how its hand is moving towards the object, and through a learning mechanism it can then activate the mirror neurons either because it commanded the action or because it sees the visual motor coordination that goes with it. And then the idea is once the system can do that, then it can now recognize the same action performed by somebody else. So on this account, evolutionarily, the mirror system arose initially to provide visual guidance for one's own actions, but then in fact was available for recognition of the actions of others. So we begin to get a social component coming into the system. The next model builds on the FARS and the M&S models and was motivated by a presentation by Bro Elstermark back in 1981. And he was trying to look at the anatomy of the spinal cord and try to dissociate which pathway out of the spinal cord controlled the arm, the reaching, versus which controlled the paw, the grasping. And so to test that, he set up a little glass tube with a piece of food in it. So at the top we see the normal cat, and he both controls his arm to insert the food into the tube, but also controls the paw then to grasp the food and bring it to his mouth. So eventually they find the place where they can lesion to preserve the reach but destroy the grasp. And so that was for them the important point. For me, the important point is that the new behavior that I show in the second row came in just 4 or 5 trials. So it wasn't a long conditioning process. The animal discovered this in about 4 or 5 trials, which is he reaches in, he tries to grasp, he fails, and sometimes knocks the food out. But once the food is knocked out, then he has another behavior available to grasp the food with his mouth. And so in 4 or 5 trials, it's no longer, I try to grasp and I fail. Oh, at last the food falls out. It's, I have this raking movement, I just rake the food out and grab it with my mouth. So how does that happen? And so this led us to a new model. And the basic, again, I won't go into the details, but the breakthrough idea, I think, and again, you're invited to read the details later, but the breakthrough idea is this, that when I told you how to model the mirror system, I said, okay, we use the internal coding of our own action to guide the recognition of the accompanying visual experience of the hand relative to the object, so that in future, if I just see someone else's hand moving in the same way towards the object, I can activate the mirror neurons. And so the idea here is that in this case, that the cat actually has two sets of mirror neurons activated, because he has the mirror neuron saying, I want to grasp the food, but now, on the occasion where by accident he does this, and the food falls out when he fails to grasp, the mirror neurons for the raking movement are activated. And so now, by exploiting that mirror neuron activity, the system can say, the grasp failed, so I push down the executability of grasping, the raking succeeded, so I push up that behavior. All right, so now in 37 seconds, a review of treats to come. And one basic model is to look at dyadic brain modeling, where we put a brain in the same brain architecture in two different heads and have visual motor interaction. And so the story that we were able to model in this paper was, how could we have the transition where a child ape tugs on the mother and mother finally comes close to the child and hugs him, to the mother more and more quickly recognizes the child's action, so the child stops the action when he sees the mother is moving toward him to hug him, and finally the child doesn't even try to do the whole action, he just does a gesture. And so this transition is called ontogenetic ritualization, and the claim is that this is a building block. So I'm going to finish with just one experiment for you, which advertises the fact that we are trying, in relation a bit to that last robot of Paul's we saw. Isn't this wonderful? So, I want you to look at the next picture for 4 seconds and formulate a verbal description. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. What did you see?
You were obscuring the view.
Did I?
Yeah.
Well, you saw it. I just didn't want to give Paul a... So what did you see?
An accident.
An accident. Okay, can you be more specific? What about the accident?
Well, people running and touching each other and falling out.
Okay, so most of you saw runners.
Well, Blade Lady fell down and the other stumbled over her.
Okay, so he saw Blade Lady. How many of you? So, how many of you saw that one of the ladies had an artificial leg?
More than
What?
more than 3 of them.
So, no, wait a minute. I didn't ask that question. How many of you saw one of them had an artificial leg?
That's what it
Okay, so maybe half of you. And how many saw they all had artificial legs? Okay, so the star student. So this is making the point that it's not, when we describe a visual scene, we are engaged in a process of attention. So how do we direct attention to build up a visual scene, and how do we then translate that into language? Conversely, if we hear a sentence, how do we create a mental image? So that is what the remaining slides show us. So thank you very much.
questions for this? Michael?
I have a question. There is this community working in the language evolution, and there is actually a discussion about the meaning of isolated words and how you can understand these isolated words, and the meaning of grammar sentences where you have to put a lot of things together in order to generate something. It seems to me that what you're trying to do here is, in some sense, a middle term of that, in the sense of having some kind of iconic language that could be further translated to a full symbolic language. Is this exactly what you're trying to do, or it's a different pathway?
So, there's a whole chapter in my book and a section in the paper which gives an example of how I think we get to grammar. So let's consider the following pantomimes. Let's see if we get it. And okay, what do those two mean?
Open and close.
Open and close what?
A door or a window.
Okay, so we have two pantomimes, one for open a door, one for close a door. What part of the pantomime was door?
It was a window, it wasn't a
No.
door.
But what kind of...
No. It was economically
Because
correct
it-
for doors. The door handles are low.
No,
Yes, but those two-
this is pantomime. So I mean, this just goes into the general point of how do you begin to disambiguate. But
Forget all.
But as a special application of DAC, which is the door application construction, the door application construction, okay, so we have these two, but there's nothing in either one that is a door. What perhaps you recognize is the movement of the door handle. So what do those two have in common? They have this. But the semantics, what does the semantics have in common? It's door. So the simple pantomime, you could say, turning a door or window handle for the purpose of, but you don't. So the idea is that by this process, a common part of the pantomime or a common part of a vocal performance could be broken out, fractionated. But now, the next step is that you now move to say, okay, so really now I can see it as a compound behavior where I have this movement and the sign for door, and that movement and the sign for door. So now I begin to have the idea of a construction for what do I do with doors, or the other way around, what can I close, what can I open? And so the suggestion is that you start with piecemeal constructions. So where a person like Chomsky would sort of say you immediately have all the nouns, all the verbs, very general rules about how to put nouns and verbs together. The idea is that in evolution we start with these very, very special purpose constructions. And slowly we built them up, and then we began to generalize. So we go from something as specific as what do you do to a door, or what do you open, to here are more and more things that one can open, not just doors. So you begin perhaps to build not a category of nouns, but a category of objects you can open. And then later, maybe you step back and you say, well, here are a number of actions, and here are different categories, and I can generalize them. So I don't have to worry about which word is just for opening, which word is just for closing, and so on. So that's the story of how we might go from what I call proto-words or hollow phrases, sort of unitary phrases, to begin to break them into pieces, but then at the same time build up a set of constructions for putting the pieces together again, and then suddenly you open up a whole new range of meanings, because you're not only combining the pieces you broke apart, but you can now combine pieces that have never been combined before.
I apologize for my question, okay? Let me do a pantomime.
Yep.
What I'm pantomized.
A train, maybe.
Okay, so my question is, if you said that language is multimodal, as in the beginning, would you know, or is there somebody who can instead of explain grasping as a movement-oriented idea from the neurons? Can we use instead movement? Can we
Okay,
use
so
concrete
yes.
sounds?
I mean, as I said, many people are opposed to giving gestures too much importance at the beginning. And so we talk about sound symbolism, we talk about onomatopoeia. But I make two different observations which are why I don't favor that. The first is that we can convey far more through pantomime than we can through sound symbolism. the number of things like opening a door, closing a
Also,
door.
I'm saying,
No, wait. So that's the first point, that I believe that, I mean, I have no data to say this is true, but just my understanding of looking at examples is there are far more things I can pantomime than I can come up with a distinctive sound that will let you recognize. So, then the claim might be, well, do you, right from the start, have both? The power of the pantomime, the power of the sound symbolism, the onomatopoeia. The catch, as I said, is that no other primate has vocal learning and control. So then you have to say, if you're going to use the imitation of a sound, you have to have vocal control to be able to imitate the sound. And I'm saying no other ape can do that, but other apes do have manual skill. So the suggestion was that by using pantomime to build it up, you then provide an adaptive opening of saying, I can make gestures that convey meaning. Now, maybe there's an advantage to bring in some vocal gestures. So another just so story might be that if I bite an apple and it's sour, I go, well, no, not the sound of the bite, but I go, because I bite it and I find it's a sour apple. So that's a sort of reflex movement, not part of vocal control, but maybe in a group, you see somebody about to pick fruit, and you go, and this is a warning. The fruit is not ripe, don't pick it. And so the idea is that there might be some of these almost reflexive sounds that get coupled to behavior, and this might then provide the adaptive, the evolutionary pressure for getting more and more adaptive control of the vocal system to be able to more freely make those sounds. And then the idea is eventually you have more and more flexible vocal control, and then then I would claim it's a historical fact, not a biological fact, that most humans learn speech rather than sign language.
It's very interesting to me, but it's not because also the sound pantomization or onomatopoeia, it's a little bit more ambiguous than the visual pantom, where you pantomize the movement, and so that maybe music is, in some sense, is so powerful because it relies in this ambiguity that is in the code. In language, we don't have a use.
Yeah.
We're trying to take out the ambiguity in music.
As I said briefly at the beginning, a majority of people would like to have vocal control come first and meaning second. So for them, the model would be birdsong or whale song, that our distant ancestors could sort of sing lullabies without words, and only later did they then apply that to, you began to associate some of these sound patterns to different objects, some through sound symbolism, some just arbitrarily, and then that fractionation process for them would proceed in the sound domain rather than in the manual domain.
I have a question that is related to that. Imagine a blind person that don't have as a feedback this notion of movement that people with vision, they are able to. In this sense, maybe the sound pantomimes will become more important for these people to acquire language than the movement or the visual understanding of movements.
Well, you have to be a little careful here. I mean, there's a difference between a modern child with a modern brain in a modern society, which is using speech, and then you do this to the blind child, they're not at a disadvantage. You take hearing away from a child and everybody else is speaking, they're at a terrible disadvantage. And there's a very interesting history, for example, of Nicaraguan deaf children. And they were treated as mentally retarded until finally a school was built where they all were together instead of being sent off to schools for the mentally retarded. and then they all had a few gestures from their family, but nothing like a language. But now they were together. But in fact, it took people who spoke Spanish to help them understand concepts that then brought them to language. So my best word is Thursday. Okay, so how do you get Thursday? You can only have that by being part of a very advanced social structure. So there's no way people are going to pantomime to each other and in one generation. So one of the questions I discuss is, if the Nicaraguan children could develop a new language in 30 years, let's say, once we had a language-ready brain, why didn't it take 30 years for us to have languages? And the claim is that there had to be this whole emergence of a system of ways to talk, things to talk about, knowing that you can express a meaning is a crucial way. Gianna?
What I suggest, I think that we can enhance this field, working with people, they are experts on body language, gestures, and they have the semantic. And they use, for example, Laban, you know Laban, so and you have software about this also. There is she's an artist and she works in Vancouver. There are you know the software about body language, and there are experts, philosophers for body language. I had one postdoc, Dr. Sida, and she works on this about philosophy. So we can do together, and because they are experts on this kind of knowledge.
I think that when people use sign language, the hand is the main vehicle, but the face and body can enrich that. So there are people who do study different types of, as you say, body language, which is not a language. It's much more like the co-speech gesture.
I call there are kinesthemas, movement, and synesthemas also, because you can using apparatus for synesthesia, you can know what are the rates, also biological rates. You can have
No, you're quite right. There is a whole range of people looking at gesture,
and
both
meaning,
gesture of the hand and gesture of the body. But I think in terms of the evolution of language, I think nonetheless we have to focus on voice and hand.
But she had
Because
research about
these,
the baianas in Carnaval, and she did a thesis about this, how the apotheosis during samba and the apotheosis, and how the baianas, the old baianas, how they do this.
Well, you can certainly say
it
that.
is very interesting.
No, I think in the book that we three took part in.
It's nice everybody have a look in the music language in the brain. There are some
And she did one
research.
thesis
we had Jerome
Dr.
Lewis.
Did thesis about this, how she is involved in this kind of psychological perception.
But the point is that yes, in the chapter by Jerome Lewis in this book called Language, Music and the Brain, Jerome Lewis studies a pygmy tribe who have ritual where dance and music and language are all indistinguishable. They're part of a special communicative system, but I wouldn't say there is a breakthrough to language. So
Okay, Hunter is the last question.
Do you think that the mirror system, the neurons, is a proof that Aristotle was right with the mimesis? The concept of mimesis of Aristotle?
mimesis.
Mimesis.
No, you may be pronouncing it correctly for this location. Well, I would say that in some sense for this theory you can break it into two parts. You can say, how do we evolve a brain like a monkey that has a mirror system but no imitation to a brain that has imitation, which is like mimesis, and then you can take the mimesis and forget the neurons and go on from there. So, with Aristotle we could talk about this part of the argument. And there's a man named Merlin Donald who has a theory of mimesis. in relation to the evolution of culture and language. So he is not worried about the brain, but many of those ideas of mimesis are in there. And one of the interesting things about him in relation to human development is the way we eventually externalized memory. Writing, for example, as a way of taking our memory from here and offloading it. And now, of course, with the web, the internet, we have even new ways of creating external memories, for better or for worse.
Okay, before we finish, thank you, Mike.